Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. Given that we have just celebrated Independence Day, I was thinking a lot about where it all began for us during the Declaration of Independence and where things have gone awry since the founding. Now, there is a lot of revisionist history concerning the Founding Fathers and concerning the founding of this country, ranging from the play Hamilton to the 1619 Project and all sorts of other tales and narratives that people tell about that time in our history. And so I personally think that all Americans could do with a better understanding of what exactly the meaning and intent was when these visionaries and statesmen wrote and signed a document so radical and innovative as the Declaration of Independence, and consequently, what informed their design of our government and the considerations that informed public discourse when the Constitution was adopted. Here's a big piece of the founding that gets lost in the way we talk about it today and the way this history is taught. In addition to new ideas such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, much of it was not a high-minded abstraction. The acts of declaring independence and designing a new government were directly concerned with material questions and the organization of just relations between a government and its people. And in many ways, that was in respect to the economy. So I'm going to set up a little contrast here. This is Joe Biden's 4th of July message that he put out a few days ago. America is an idea that is stronger than any army, bigger than any ocean, more powerful than any dictator or tyrant. It gives hope to the most desperate people on earth. It guarantees that everyone is treated with dignity and gives hate no safe harbor. It instills in every person in this country the belief that no matter where you start in life, there's nothing you can't achieve if you work at it. President Joe Biden. Okay, so this is interesting and erroneous for a number of reasons, but there's one thing that we must be clear on This Is Your Country. America is not an idea. It's our home. It has borders. It has laws. It is not a charity being run for the, quote, most desperate people on earth. It's a treasure, and it belongs to a defined population of citizens. We have an economy. We have sovereignty. We have rule of law. And as a consequence, material considerations matter, meaning economic conditions in present and in future. And so this is why I emphasize that so much of the act of declaring independence at the beginning of this country's founding had to do with substantial material questions of economics, trade, taxation, and so on. And abstracting away from that to pretend that it was all about feel-good magic and giving hope to the desperate and tolerance and accommodating desperation is simply fabulism. It is revisionist history, and it's misleading Americans about their inheritance and about their country's founding. And most notably by Joe Biden here, it is a slimy trick by politicians who want to absolve themselves of responsibility for dealing with material questions where Americans are being hurt, including trade, immigration, fiscal and monetary policy, and so on. So, to put a finer point on it, you don't have to take my word for it. Let's note these places where you can see this in the founding, where the founding fathers were explicitly addressing this. First, the founders were fiercely protective of trade and exports, and Alexander Hamilton explicitly used this argument to explain why they needed to ratify the Constitution, establish the U.S. government, and he addressed this in Federalist number 11. So this one is concerning commercial activity and trade and shipping and so on. And he writes, under a vigorous national government, the natural strength and resources of the country, directed to a common interest, would baffle all the combinations of European jealousy to restrain our growth. This situation would even take away the motive to such combinations by inducing an impracticability of success. An active commerce, an extensive navigation, and a flourishing marine would then be the inevitable offspring of moral and physical necessity. We might defy the little arts of little politicians to control or vary the irresistible and unchangeable course of nature. But in a state of disunion, these combinations might exist and might operate with success. it would be in the power of the maritime nations to prescribe the conditions of our political existence. And as they have a common interest in being our carriers and still more in preventing our being theirs, they would in all probability combine to embarrass our navigation in such a manner as would in effect destroy it and confine us to a passive commerce. We should thus be compelled to content ourselves with the first price of our commodities and to see the profits of our trade snatched from us to enrich our enemies and persecutors. That unequaled spirit of enterprise, which signalizes the genius of the American merchants and navigators, and which is in itself an inexhaustible mine of national wealth, would be stifled and lost, and poverty and disgrace would overspread the country, which, with wisdom, might make herself the admiration and envy of the world. So here, Alexander Hamilton is describing the necessity of having the strength of a united government that can advance this type of commerce and advance this type of trade activity that makes a country strong and prosperous. And he's also highlighting the fact that other countries desperately want to see their competitor nations too weak to conduct this type of actively vigorous commercial trading enterprise. And so it cannot be overstated how important this was to the people designing our country that we have a strong, materially sound export economy where we protect our shipping, we protect our exports, where it was acknowledged by them that you cannot have a functioning economy without protecting your exports and building them up in a really significant way. So that was one of the most compelling arguments that he was making to the citizens of this country. And it's especially funny because he was considering this such an obvious thing to state and emphasize, something so on its face persuasive and compelling, that he actually starts Federalist number 11 with this statement. The importance of the Union in a commercial light is one of those points about which there is least room to entertain a difference of opinion, and which has, in fact, commanded the most general assent of men who have any acquaintance with the subject. This applies as well to our intercourse with foreign countries as with each other. So his point there is that it is so obvious how badly a nation needs to protect its trade for its own self-interest, to build up its prosperity, to build up its people, to build up a future, that he's saying this is a topic for which there is least room to entertain a difference of opinion. This will become relevant in the later episode as we discuss the ways that commerce and trade and exports have been subverted by our own policymakers, our own government. But moving right along, just to demonstrate that this is not me speculating or developing theories about the founding, this is an element of our history that is totally overlooked in current discourse. So this is not particularly well known anymore, and it is especially well forgotten among the people running our country. But the first major piece of legislation passed in Congress in 1789, once our United States were formed, was a tariff. And many nowadays try to use references to trade in the Declaration of Independence as referring to some kind of early prototype of globalist borderlessness. But when they were referencing trade as a grievance for which they were justifying the Declaration of Independence, they were referring to not being able to conduct economic trade in the interest of our country according to conditions that we found satisfactory. It had to do with being taken advantage of. And this, again, will become later in the case studies I present in this episode, but this is actually something the source I found writing this up was PBS, of all places. And they wrote, on July 4th of 1789, the United States passed its first significant piece of legislation, a tariff. More precisely, a long list of tariffs around 5% and higher. That might sound surprising given the Declaration's complaint about free trade, but the newly formed country had more immediate worries. The United States was broke. It needed revenue. The Tariff Act of 1789, sponsored by James Madison, was designed to address three pressures facing the United States. 1, it was suffering under the debt accumulated after waging war against England. 2, the government needed a revenue source moving forward. Even if there had been no war debt, it wasn't obvious in America's early years how the government was going to fund its activities. 3. America had yet to experience its industrial revolution, and nascent producers were being crushed by imports from Europe. So, the United States was amassing debt and being flooded by imports. That sounds awfully familiar. In fact, things weren't so different back then, and the same arguments took place then as today. To many founders, tariffs looked like an attractive solution to these pressures. After all, just as we've heard from Trump, tariffs protect domestic producers from competition, and they raise revenue without directly taxing citizens. It sounds like a good deal. So that, as I say, was a write-up from PBS explaining the legislation at the time. I appreciate that this author tethers it back to the arguments about tariffs when President Trump was running, because this foundational element of our country and our economy, the people who were directly designing our government, it gets lost in the discourse now, and many experts behave as though it has always been a fundamental truth of economics that quote-unquote free trade is an element of designing a successful economy and a successful country. And as we have seen, and as we will discuss later in this episode, it simply is not the case. And the further we drift from these fundamental truths that the founding fathers were considering and were acting on when they were designing our government, the further our country risks sinking into the abyss. So beyond Alexander Hamilton writing about this, and beyond James Madison introducing that first significant legislation in Congress, you had John Jay, who wrote, "With France and with Britain and with most other European nations, we are rivals in navigation and the carrying trade, and we shall deceive ourselves if we suppose that any of them will rejoice to see these flourish in our hands." So these were statesmen who were acknowledging that trade is the most fundamental form of competition with a foreign nation outside of direct military conflict. And so they knew that this is something they had to protect. How we have gone so far astray from that is really an essential question of our time. But moving right along, I hope that these citations are sufficient to reorient our thinking a little bit more about what material considerations the founders had in mind with regard to the questions of independence and just government. Let's tether this all back to the present here. Plainly speaking, the extent of subversion and interloping by foreign lobbies, foreign agents, and global obligations and ideological causes, commitments that have nothing to do with our national interest, is so extensive that we do not really have anything close to our traditional understanding of what our country was supposed to be or should be to live up to its promise. And we won't until we can move away from this trend of deeply corrupt, compromised activity that has drastically inverted the role of our government against the people of this country. One reason that I cite these sentiments from the founding fathers is that we will not be able to restore the promise of our country until we can effectively declare independence from subversive elements that hurt the American people and distort our government for their ends. Now, a lot of people have a sense that things are compromised among the people who make decisions in our country, or at the very least, overly concentrated in the hands of the few. It's obvious that things don't happen spontaneously. Important decisions that affect all of us are made, but we are not personally making any of them, and we are not personally consulted on them. Now, some people think this is not nefarious, that the power is properly and rightly concentrated in the hands of experts and neutral government bureaucrats. But in addition, many people in Washington have just become accustomed to the fact that everything is controlled by lobbyists and donors, and they believe it's probably not for the best, but it's what we've got. If you are a regular listener of This Is Your Country, you know that I don't settle for that. You know that my doctrine is that there is right and wrong, and you cannot continue on this trajectory of extraction and plundering of the American people through corruption and abuse of our institutions. Now, as I've said before, much of Trump's power and appeal was in his ability to be disruptive because he was not beholden to any of these types of interests. He did not need foreign lobbies to give him money. He did not need corporations donors to give him money. He was independently wealthy, and he was often saying the exact same things on many policy positions, from monetary policy to trade policy, for decades before he ran for office. And there is a lot that he exposed as contradicting the will of the people in Washington. He exposed the intelligence community. He exposed the Beltway press. He exposed a lot of the activity that happens among the bureaucrats in agencies, among people who feel they don't answer to the president, who is duly elected by the people. So, as the left likes to say, there is more work to do because President Trump exposed a huge amount of this dysfunction, but there is a lot that was left unaddressed. In the rest of this episode, we will look at a couple of case studies demonstrating how badly we need to declare our independence and restore a dynamic where we have representation in Washington once more. This is the stuff that truly rules politicians in Washington. I'm going to go through some of these case studies. I have seen it personally. I have seen the ways that people in the Washington swamp are compelled, whether through payouts, threats, or simply weak loyalty, to make decisions with our country's power and resources that make our nation weaker. So here are a couple ways in which these factions that have nothing to do with the interests of the American people but manage to enjoy a huge amount of power and influence in Washington actually get their aspirations turned into reality through their influence in our government. So, first example is the Washington think tanks. And oftentimes, these institutions are laundering a foreign government's preferences through the veneer of academic policy analysis, through white papers and seemingly neutral studies and data and so on and so forth. But a lot of times they actually end up getting caught doing this. And it may be a mystery to a lot of people in the rest of the country who wonder how the politicians in Washington get all of these ideas about foreign intervention and foreign causes that are suddenly portrayed to the people as a desperate, immediate need that we address with a huge amount of public resources. But a lot of times it's not spontaneous. It's that someone who is benefiting from this cause is paying a think tank to launder it to politicians under the guise of good public policy. In just one example, this was actually a surprisingly intelligent op-ed in the Washington Post. The headline is, "It's time to drain the foreign influence swamp for real." This was written by Josh Rogan in November of 2021. Quote, "In Washington, foreign interests use money to influence policy through a variety of schemes, often hidden. Foreign lobbying must be reported by law, but that's only one conduit foreign money can use to enter U.S. politics. Dozens of U.S. think tanks and other policy organizations take money from foreign countries and corporations without ever disclosing the details. The staffers who have received this financing then write policy papers and testify before Congress, posing as objective, disinterested experts. It's a win-win for the think tanks, which collect millions, and for the foreign actors who can successfully spread their influence in D.C. without scrutiny. But our democracy loses because this system of soft corruption undermines the integrity of our policymaking process. Americans have now woken up to the risks of foreign influence on Facebook, but think tankers are still allowed to use loops to testify to Congress without disclosing which foreign countries are funding them. Why are we letting them get away with it? And it's interesting because the author does address what certain politicians are trying to do to address this form of corruption. He writes, "Now a group of House Republicans is trying to close that and other loopholes in congressional rules. Republican Study Committee Chairman, Representative Jim Banks from Indiana, has introduced a, quote, truth in testimony reform resolution, which aims to close the loopholes and force congressional witnesses to disclose their foreign paymasters. Quote, Congress works best when all the cards are face up on the table, Banks said in a statement. It's past time we expose malign foreign influence and we take the masks off those individuals working for other countries who are testifying before Congress. I urge my colleagues to pass this rule as soon as possible." The rule has 43 co-sponsors, all Republican. There has been some interest on the Democratic side in joining the effort, but no Democrats are publicly supporting it yet. So it's just fascinating to me that this is such a deeply entrenched problem of foreign money influencing the policy ecosystem in Washington, that you have these leaders in Congress like Jim Banks trying to take it up as an agenda item. And it is so controversial to imply that members of Congress shouldn't be enabling this type of soft corruption that Democrats won't even publicly support this idea. And this is just one example of the ways in which foreign influence, corrupt influence, changes the policy milieu in Washington to a point where the government is being used for ends that have nothing to do with the interests of the American citizens. And you saw this again when the huge behemoth think tank in DC called the Brookings Institution got caught with their president of the whole think tank hopelessly compromised by a foreign country. So this was in the New York Times just very recently with the headline, "Retired General Investigated Over Undisclosed Lobbying for Qatar." Documents show that the Justice Department has records indicating that John Allen, who now heads the Brookings Institution, secretly lobbied for Qatar and lied about it to federal agents. Quote, "His time at Central Command helped him cement ties with senior Qatari leaders. In 2011, he was given a 4th star and took command of all American and NATO troops in Afghanistan until 2013. In 2016, the year before the court document states his lobbying effort for Qatar began, General Allen was an advisor to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, and he spoke that year at the Democratic National Convention. He took over as the president of Brookings in November 2017. Brookings once had a large campus in Doha. The campus was established years before General Allen became president of the think tank, which makes you wonder how far does this go back. In September, according to its website, Brookings ended its affiliation with the Doha Institute, which is now called the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Guess they got nervous when the feds started sniffing around. And just to illustrate the extent to which this guy was completely compromised by a foreign country, one of these compromised figures that he was involved with in these Qatari deals had a WhatsApp message where he said, "Does General Allen know his place or his position?" So that's just really revealing of the extent to which this guy was totally compromised by these foreign entities. And he's leading this highly prestigious institution in Washington. And none of this was regarded as a problem until he literally got rolled up by the feds. So the fact that this is happening in such plain sight, including with this example of this guy, John Allen, who was a 4-star general in the United States military. Do you think this stuff begins when they leave their government post, that the second their badge is deactivated, it's a perfectly clear line, just a totally spontaneous development, and they didn't have any of these, they weren't laying the groundwork for this, they weren't doing work on anyone's behalf, conducting favors and so on until they left the government? I mean, this raises all kinds of questions about how deep this goes with people who are supposed to be stewarding our nation to success, and they are completely compromised by foreign countries. And again, it's important to emphasize that this was the type of corrupt activity and subversion that the founding fathers were deeply concerned about. George Washington wrote, "History and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side and serve to veil and even second the arts of influence on the other. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite are liable to become suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests." It's just amazing how prescient this type of observation was, that this would be a real risk to a nation like the United States, and that these are the types of temptations that many politicians succumb to, but that we have a duty as citizens to hold them accountable. And these other institutions in our country have a duty to not compound and reward. So beyond the think tanks, which take foreign money and launder their influence through this patina of academic legitimacy, you've also got a whole host of foreign lobbies and multinational corporations promoting significant foreign interests or promoting their interest at the expense of the nation's interest. The people protecting this dynamic always reveal themselves by hurling a bunch of epithets at anyone willing to put the pieces together and who has nothing to lose from calling it out. So when President Trump would emphasize that a lot of people were opposing tariffs and opposing his trade policy because they were compromised by the Chinese, he would always be attacked with epithets about xenophobia and so on and so forth. But it really is a legitimate factor that changes policy outcomes in the United States. So the American people have a responsibility to investigate it and to talk about it. And for example, I think many Americans were appalled when last year on Memorial Day, Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina held up a sign in a photo op. He had traveled to Israel on Memorial Day, and the sign that he held up in this photo op said, "More for Israel." Now, some people build entire careers saying that you shouldn't be allowed to criticize the United States' relationship with Israel at all, but they can say anything they want. The fact is, he is elected to represent the state of South Carolina, and to me, that puts the onus on him to justify his deviant behavior, not on American citizens who could be forgiven for thinking that this inversion of his duty is unusual. Did he just spontaneously wake up and decide that this cause is essential to the American people, that this is what he should be doing on Memorial Day of all times? Obviously, he's not doing this out of altruism. If only the people of South Carolina could afford the lobbyists that other entities can in Washington to get their senator to actually represent them. Beyond alliances and relationships with other nations whose interests may at times contradict the interests of the United States, you've also got examples of corporations doing this. So you had McKinsey, the consulting giant, advising China in a lot of respects at the same time as they were advising the Pentagon on matters of national defense and national security. So how everyone involved doesn't see this as an intolerably disloyal conflict of interest, I don't know. But luckily, we did have at least one leader trying to focus on this, and it was Marco Rubio who was investigating this relationship. So this was in NBC News, and the headline was, "Advising both Chinese state companies and the Pentagon, McKinsey & Company comes under scrutiny." So here we go. Global consulting giant McKinsey & Company's work with both the Pentagon and powerful Chinese state-owned enterprises poses a potential risk to national security that federal agencies can no longer ignore, lawmakers and critics say. McKinsey's consulting contracts with the federal government give it an insider's view of U.S. military planning, intelligence, and high-tech weapons programs. But the firm also advises Chinese state-run enterprises that have supported Beijing's naval buildup in the Pacific and played a key role in China's efforts to extend its influence around the world. There is no evidence or allegation that McKinsey has damaged U.S. national security, and U.S. authorities have not charged the firm with violating federal contracting laws related to its work with Chinese clients. But with tensions high between China and the U.S., McKinsey's business operations in both countries are coming under growing scrutiny. Critics say the firm, the world's largest consulting company, needs to divulge more details about its work in China, particularly amid concerns in Washington about Beijing's industrial espionage, arms buildup, and intellectual property theft. What's especially astonishing is that McKinsey was advising a Chinese company related to the Chinese government on building up their naval operations and naval capacity. Meanwhile, McKinsey is also advising the U.S. Navy on its plans to modernize its quote-unquote network of naval shipyards. I mean, this is just astonishing. Like, do you really believe that they're not trading on this proximity to the United States government's military operations and the Pentagon and our naval capacity? Do you really think that that's not one reason that they have a comparative advantage over other consulting companies with the Chinese government, which is that they have access to all of this information and all of this knowledge? And the fact that this is allowed to continue unexamined is just amazing. And just to tether this back to the founding fathers, where they were really quite prescient about this type of activity, Thomas Jefferson wrote, Merchants have no country. The mere spot they stand on does not constitute so strong an attachment as that from which they draw their gains. Does that sound like McKinsey to you, enriching itself off of helping the Chinese build up their naval capacity while allegedly advising the US government on building up theirs? Seems pretty relevant to a company, McKinsey, which has advised a number of clients that were eventually blacklisted by the US government as actively undermining US national security interests. These are the types of companies that have a huge amount of sway in American politics and American policy, and when we don't contend honestly about how badly they are subverting our nation's interests, we are just going to go further down the tubes. And this is why I emphasize that these were the types of considerations that the founding fathers were factoring into the design of their government and factoring into questions of independence. Because when you cannot run a country with a proper economy that is aligned with the nation's interest, then you are going to have a serious extraction and plunder and looting problem where people just use the prosperity of the nation and the public resources as a means to enrich themselves at the cost of the people of this country. So kudos to Senator Marco Rubio for trying to investigate this. I believe the firm was still strong-arming him for quite some time, trying to prevent him from getting answers about this. But rest assured, the ugly truth is down there somewhere, and we have a responsibility to figure it out. So moving right along, you can also see examples of this with other giant corporations, giant finance institutions. You had, just for example, Goldman Sachs laundering a huge amount of propaganda about what a great market China was to be in, how American businesses should pivot to serving the Chinese markets, being enmeshed in the Chinese markets because the Chinese consumer was the consumer of the future. They were trying to create this self-fulfilling prophecy by using their credibility and their position, their prestige, to direct capital to their preferred clients, which apparently were the Chinese. And unfortunately, we ended up getting stuck with a Goldman Sachs guy named Gary Cohn, who came into the Trump administration as the National Economic Council director, and he directly contradicted the president's trade and tariff policy. Constantly, he was undermining. It makes you wonder the extent to which Goldman Sachs and even China itself were depending on Gary Cohn's slick-tongued ability to talk various advisors out of putting tariffs on China and other exporting nations. But after Gary Cohn left the administration, he was constantly doing these interviews about how tariffs are not a proper policy tool and how they will not help the American economy get where we want to go. So in this one, he says, tariffs don't work. If anything, they hurt the economy because if you're a typical American worker, you have a finite amount of income to spend. He was saying this on Freakonomics radio show. If you have to spend more on the necessity products that you need to live, you have less to spend on the services that you want to buy. Okay, obviously, but when it's coming at the cost of having a functional economy, having a country that can make anything at all, you have to wonder whether saving $100 on a television is really exactly where the consumer's best interest lies. And then Gary Cohn is going back and forth with the interviewer where they're saying that all economists in the world agree that tariffs don't work, and there's only one in the world who doesn't, and they're referring to Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor. And it's like, yeah, just Peter Navarro and all of the founding fathers who cared about the prosperity of our nation and literally designed the government of this country. So remember, their first act of significant legislation, a tariff, because that's how you make your country strong and how you make your economy functional. You cannot have a sustainable economy that is purely based on importing stuff that consumers want. You cannot do it. And it's just one final example of how unbelievably short-sighted and disloyal so many of these corporate interests are. You had, in 2009, this headline, Pfizer to build R&D facility in Wuhan, China. An agreement has been signed to establish a new Pfizer R&D center in Wuhan, which the firm says represents an expansion of its existing facility in Shanghai. Pfizer noted that its Wuhan operation will liaise with local research institutes and universities, quote, utilizing the rich resources of local talent and existing industry capabilities to develop research collaborations. it stressed that Shanghai will remain the operations hub of Pfizer's R&D effort in China, which just raises the question, why is Pfizer's R&D effort in China to begin with? It presents obvious liabilities of IP theft and copyright issues. As we've now seen, that was in 2009. But when you get too close to such amateurish scientific development efforts as happen in China, you are really playing with fire. So this type of activity from corporations, who I assume were simply trying to gain access to the Chinese market, they ended up really shooting themselves in the foot with eventually, like, you can read these other headlines. Within a couple of years, you had headlines like, Pfizer to stop selling vaccines in China after failing to get license renewal. So this was a well-known tactic of the Chinese government, was to lure corporations to do business there. One condition of them doing business there was that they would have to give up their intellectual property. And then after they've given up all of their know-how and all of their innovations, the government says, oh, we're not going to give you a license to operate and sell that here anymore, because they just start manufacturing it themselves. So there's only a couple of years between these two different headlines of Pfizer building its R&D factory in Wuhan in 2009, Pfizer having its license to sell vaccines revoked in China in 2015. And then they just kept doing this. Another headline, Pfizer loses yet another Viagra trademark dispute in China. So they just kept losing these battles with the Chinese government to maintain any ability to profit off of their IP. So these entities have so much sway over things that affect the national interests of this country. And they cannot even be trusted to understand their own self-interest. And I actually read something in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago about how China during the pandemic was not letting these corporate executives come into their country at all. And so the executives, the operations chiefs and so on would try to come into China to take a look at their factories or have meetings. And the Chinese government would say, no, we're so sorry. You can't come to our country and take a look at your factory. Better luck next time. So, as I say, this is the type of short-sightedness, totally dysfunctional business sense that any of these corporations had when they started enmeshing their companies with foreign countries, moving jobs, leaving the United States, trying to have their cake and eat it too. And it just ended up being unbelievably stupid business. And yet these are the types of people who enjoy so much sway over what happens in our own country's policymaking. Is it making sense now why so many powerful institutions united against President Trump when this is the type of thing? This was his reaction to another instance of Pfizer moving some operations out of our country. In 2015, here's how this was written up. Real estate mogul Donald Trump isn't happy with Pfizer and Allergan's announcement on Monday that the two companies would merge to form a corporate drug-making behemoth. Quote, the fact that Pfizer is leaving our country with a tremendous loss of jobs is disgusting, he said in a statement to Business Insider. The Republican presidential frontrunner added, our politicians should be ashamed. Trump has been particularly critical of U.S. companies that shift their operations overseas. For example, he has repeatedly vowed never to eat Oreo cookies again to protest Nabisco moving a plant to Mexico. So this is how you have to negotiate for your country. You have to have a real understanding of how these types of powerful interests manage to get at both bites at the apple. They want to profit in other countries that hate us, and they want to extract and pillage in our country too. So unfortunately, this is still a problem, especially as we transition from President Trump to Joe Biden. You had a transition back to this type of rule by questionable alliances, rule by ideological experiments, instead of our government's primary concern being the material welfare of the American people. You got the Biden administration lifting tariffs on solar products, which just enables the Chinese products to be dumped all over the market, potentially even putting American solar producers out of business. You've got the Biden administration shutting down investigations into Chinese espionage in academia and in other domains. You have Biden going to the G7 meeting and making these silly, frivolous green energy pledges that just hurt our country instead of finding reasonable solutions. And now you've got much of the Senate trying to repeal President Trump's tariffs on China, it claiming that it will help relieve inflation, which is such a blatant lie. Even the New York Times had to call it out and say, this is not going to have any tangible effect on inflation. It's not even worth making that argument. And you even have a huge number of GOP senators participating in this charade, saying that we need to repeal the tariffs to relieve inflation. And those are often the types like Portman and Toomey who are congratulated in the press and in the Washington establishment for their lovely decorum and their bipartisanship, when the fact is they're protecting something deeply evil and destructive. We've seen how all these foreign entanglements and giving preferential treatment to these foreign lobbies and foreign causes is so damaging to our country. And yet they're unpersuaded, they're undeterred. The globalism train has fallen off the tracks, but they won't get off. They are deeply committed to this doctrine that is destroying our nation. And this is no way for our country to continue. We need to declare independence from these types of arrangements. And you simply cannot do that when all of our politicians are owned by global considerations, multinational companies, etc., abstracting away from the cause of our nation, hurting our people, hurting our future, taking no responsibility for the material well-being of the citizens of this country. Because you have all this evidence from the founding fathers that this was essential to the prosperity of our country. And these were the most well-educated visionaries who knew the art of statesmanship. They knew the art of statecraft. And to ignore all of these lessons that were inherent in how they designed our government is so foolish and so short-sighted that it really becomes an existential question of whether we can elect better leaders to our government to fix these problems. Maybe someone should reread to Rob Portman and Pat Toomey and to the entire Joe Biden administration some of these quotes from the founding fathers, such as Alexander Hamilton. The substitution of foreign for domestic manufactures is a transfer to foreign nations of the advantages accruing from the employment of machinery in the modes in which it is most capable of being employed, with most utility and to the greatest extent. So clearly, offshoring your entire industrial base to another nation is pretty much the biggest gift of all time that you could give them. And that's exactly what the people running our country did. An exclusive possession of the home market ought to be secured to the domestic manufacturers as fast as circumstances will admit. Nothing is more practicable and nothing more desirable. That's Alexander Hamilton again talking about the importance of shoring up your own manufacturers in your own country. So how these fundamental truths got lost, it's not really a mystery because there's so much corruption and so much compromised activity, but it is deeply sad that when you try to advance a more pro-American understanding of how we should be conducting economic policy in this country, you are countered with a barrage of deceitful propaganda about how wonderful globalism and quote-unquote free trade are, when really they're just hurting our country and hurting our future. So in closing, from foreign entanglements to global alliances to diminishing our export economy, our government has done virtually everything against the interest of the people that the founding fathers explicitly warned us about. I want to give a quick shout out to a pseudonymous friend for being an assiduous chronicler of the founders' thinking on these foundational elements of our government. A couple of friends of mine who are really well-versed in this type of history, and I appreciate them helping with a little research for this episode. And it's just a blessing to know such well-informed people, and I hope that you enjoyed this little walk through our founding history. So the bottom line of all of this is that even when it's not outright illegal, such as the questions about the McKinsey activity, questions about some of these other elements influencing think tanks and so on, it's deceptive, it's deceitful, and it's disenfranchising. It is literally ruining our country by creating distortions of what factors should go into policy decisions, trajectories of entire economic sectors, even military sectors. If there's some real conflict of interest with McKinsey advising our Navy and advising the Chinese on theirs. These decisions change the allocation of public capital, public resources. They change the economic incentives to make certain things favorable and other things disfavorable, all divorced from the national interest. If this is not true subversion of the levers of power, of the institutions of government in this country, I don't know what is. The question of being compromised by foreign interests, in my mind, was not properly explored in the 2020 election because it obviously would have been disadvantageous for the candidate Joe Biden, who is the protector of the corporate globalist doctrine at any cost. You can see this in action when his National Economic Council Director Brian Deese said gas prices will remain high as long as necessary to protect the liberal world order. This is the exact perfect example of what I am referring to when I note that our leaders subjugate material conditions to ideological experiments. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. In short, you have to guard your country jealously, or people will see it as a giant pile of money and they're in the business of extraction. So when we are examining current events, if something seems blatantly not in the national interest, or someone is giving you a really abstract and ideological and roundabout answer about why it's more of a moral crusade, not a directly material consideration for the American interest, you need to keep your wits about you and you need to play spot the foreign interloper, spot the compromised entity, spot the America Last extractive looter and profiteer, because I guarantee you they're in there somewhere. It's hurting the people of this country and we have to take it back. We need real independence once again. Thank you for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey.